from within hollowed halls of mountain stone, to the moonlit forests where wolves do roam, whether we're talking of beasts of ancient myth, or talking about those greatest smiths. It's time to talk about the origins of Dwarves and Werewolves. Hello everybody, I'm Kyle, I am the Dork. One thing, I made that up on the spot. That was not the intro. That was all off the dome. I am so proud of myself, and this is staying in the final cut, because you know what, gosh darn it, you need to know that I did that on the fly. But in any case, I am Kyle, I am the Dork. Welcome to Desks and Dorks. If you're brand new here, we talk about tabletop role-playing games and how you can use history as both an inspiration and as a way to sort of zhuzh up the stuff that you like to make. A couple things, if you really like the content that we produce here, all of the YouTube pleasantries, liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing go quite a long way. And this is especially true because this video only exists because all of you managed to hit 500 likes within like a 36-hour time period, allowing these two monsters to come out of the void and into YouTube. So, with that being said, the single best way that you can support us, however, is by purchasing our games. You can get them from Indie Press Revolution, Worldwide Distribution, Exalted Funeral, and at itch.io, either by taking a picture using your phone for that QR code or the link in the description below. Lastly, if you'd like to join the Discord, that's totally free. You can talk to us about games and have a say in the kind of content that we make. But with that out of the way, let's discuss. We are going to be talking about the origins of both dwarves and werewolves in history and folklore. We're going to talk about how those things differ in depiction from the monsters in our games and the monsters as they are presented in history. And then lastly, I'm going to chuck some really interesting ideas at you on how to incorporate both dwarves and werewolves into your games. And finally, two really quick things. I was a Eurocentric medievalist. It's where my training lies. So a lot of my research, a lot of the stuff that I'm focusing on in this video and that I focused on in my studies was on Europe. I'm going to be leaving out and omitting quite a few cultures and time periods because I don't have the training that I think would give me the ability to present those stories, those histories, and those cultures with the nuance that they are deserving of. Those time periods, those peoples, those stories, they are worth interacting with, but again, I don't feel like I have the nuance and skill to represent them properly. It's why they're being omitted here, but it does bear mentioning. That's good scholarship. And lastly, if you're going to lean in some of the horrific elements of this, I would encourage you to use your safety tools. Just make sure that you're doing your due diligence as a game master, check in on your players, and make sure they're doing okay. With that out of the way, let's talk about dwarves, baby. Dwarves are really hard for us to sort of unpack because they're wrapped up not just in the historical misconceptions about them, the folkloric misconceptions about them, but the wealth of popular media that surrounds dwarves, whether we're talking about stuff like Tolkien, or we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons, or the work of Warhammer, or World of Warcraft. Dwarves are everywhere. They're so popular within our pop culture that it's really difficult for us to sort of parse through what was and what is true, at least from a historic standpoint, right? Like when we're talking to try to unpack what really is authentic dwarven folktales as opposed to modern popular reinvention. That was certainly a big struggle here in this video as I attempted to parse my way through some of the legends and histories, but I was able to find out a good bit of stuff. A few things to establish though, and this is I think one of the most important ones. Like when we think of dwarves, a lot of times they're wrapped up in Nordic imagery and Norse culture, the Celtic knots or the Nordic knots as an example of that. And I think that's due to, again, the influence of Tolkien and of course I think the influence of World of Warcraft as well, which has gone on a long way in making dwarves feel a little bit more Norse than I think they would usually feel. It's important for us to remember dwarves are actually Proto-Germanic, which means that they come from that time period like during, even before the fall of the Roman Empire, where that was that Germanic diaspora, as you know, the Huns and other forces started to like seep in, and those tribes begin to go out. So I think that's part of the reason why dwarf legends and the dwarf in general is so widespread. The first time that they appear in written sources, however, they are Norse written sources. So one of them is the Riddarsugur, which is literally translated the Rider Saga, or the Tale of Knights. This is a collection of chivalric or close to chivalric myths and legends about knights that pops up around 1200. They're also found in the Fornaldur Saga, which is around 1300. And if you watched our previous video on trolls and goblins, you will be familiar with the Prose Edda, which is again a collection of Norse myth, legend, and folklore that pops up around 1200. I like this particular image from the Prose Edda as well, because if you look at that middle panel, that's a dwarf, which is pretty cool. You can even tell that the particular tool in his hand is not one for war, but one for craftsmanship, which I do like quite a bit. It's important for us to remember all of these stories, all of these collections are a reflection of and an example of a larger oral folk tradition that we sadly do not have the records for. These are all the first times that dwarves appear in the written record, but they are evidence of a richer, far more robust oral tradition that we simply just don't have the timestamps for. Now, it's important for us to understand from a linguistic standpoint where dwarfs came from, and I'm going to address something really quick. There is some debate around whether or not dwarves is the proper way to refer to a plural of dwarf. There is, I think it's, I'm going to go out on a limb because I couldn't find anything concrete on it, a sort of apocryphal thing that it's attributed to a mistranslation by J.R.R. Tolkien, who it was really just supposed to be dwarfs. I went back and forth finding a little bit of research, and I found things in both camps. I am not a linguist. I don't have a dog in this race, or a horse in this race, or a dwarf in this fight, and so I am going to be using dwarf and dwarves interchangeably. However, I do know where we get the word dwarf from. Originally, at least for us, the earliest translations draw from the word dwerg, which is Old English, but dwerg is actually a derivation of dwesgaz, which is, again, a Proto-Germanic phrase. It's part of the reason we know that dwarves stem from that Proto-Germanic time period. I do want you to consider something, however, and that is something that I didn't stress enough the last time that I did a video like this on these monsters. The written depictions that we have are, again, evidence of a greater, far richer oral tradition. It's really imperative for you as a scholar and as a storyteller to remember that in the oral tradition, these tales would have been passed down from storyteller to storyteller, from tribe to tribe, from parent to child, from friend to friend, and as a result, these stories take on a life of their own. I know I touched on this like 2 seconds ago, but I think it's so important. I'm going to stress this again. The written works that we have access to, even though they are dated at 1200 or 1300, are evidence of a far deeper, far richer tradition that we just simply do not have the access to, right? Again, it's like looking for fossilized footprints in the dirt. Yes, we don't have the full creature, but we do have the footprint, and that does allow us to gain information about the things that walked before. It's very similar to that, and I'm going to be calling it sometimes a folkloric footprint, which I think is kind of a cool way to phrase it, multiple times in this video. I just want to point that out right now. Now, let's talk about some of the similarities, though, between the dwarves in folklore and history and the dwarves in modern RPGs. So, one is the Forge. This is a absolutely incredible and sort of all-encompassing, all-important image when we talk about dwarves, and it bears true both in the folklore and in modern representation. I have included a picture of Brock and Sindri here from God of War. What a great game, because Brock and Sindri are important figures, not just in, again, this very popular piece of modern media, but in the actual tales. Brock and Sindri are the ones who forge both Mjolnir, as well as a bunch of other weapons and artifacts for the Norse pantheon. It's important for us to consider, too, that a dwarf is the one that forges the ribbon that binds Fenrir, the world wolf, essentially, and sort of stops him from breaking loose. So there's a long-standing tradition of dwarves being fantastic craftsmen, blacksmiths, and artificers, and I don't mean that like the magical artificer, but artificers and someone who practices artifice throughout all of folklore and legend. That continues to bear out. Booze also continues to be a really relevant, really important thing. Dwarves can be seen engaging in drinking, and in some cases, especially in one particularly Nordic legend, the dwarves murder a guest and use his blood to make the mead of truth. So there's a heavy connection with dwarves and alcohol that does exist in the folklore, which is kind of neat. Again, super important. I don't think that they're like out there drinking kind of like they do in these massive mead halls, but there is a connection. It does bear mentioning. There are, however, some major major differences from the dwarves of folklore and history, that folkloric footprint that we were talking about, in the ones in modern tabletop RPGs. I'm going to address grudges right now because I know there's a really big swath of my audience that loves Warhammer Fantasy. I'm going to tell you right now, this has absolutely zero basis in actual dwarven folklore and legend. The idea that a dwarf family or clan would hold a grudge for centuries is not something that is dwarven or dwarvish, whatever you want to call it. No, it is in fact a Norse cultural value. The dwarves of Warhammer have a heavy emphasis and heavy inspiration, particularly on dwarven Nordic legends. And this is when I need to tell you all that vendetta culture was a huge deal for the early Vikings. One of the things I think was really fascinating when I was studying them for my history degree was the idea of the holmgang, which is essentially a court-sanctioned battle between two people in order to settle civil disputes, not like matters of state, right? This is not the heads of two armies coming together to determine the fate of two kingdoms, right? These are people essentially arguing about taxes and land disputes in a sanctioned 1v1 fight. Usually this would take place in a clearing or on a small island where you couldn't have like many bystanders or opportunities to run away. If those things could not be found, what would happen is you would cordon off an area, sometimes even placing animal fur onto the ground and using that as the sort of barriers for the competition. Dwarven vendetta culture is a massive thing because Nordic vendetta culture was a real thing. Many of the songs, poems, and stories in Norse legend, Norse history, and Norse myth focus on vengeance, on the taking of vengeance, and on the taking of life in exchange for slights, either real or imagined. Hamlet, by the way, a vendetta story, is based on a larger, more ancient Viking myth of Hamnet. So again, there's that folkloric footprint that I was talking about, and it's crept its way into the lives of dwarves. The dwarven grudge, not a thing because of the dwarves, it's a thing because of the Vikings. And again, you can actually look up Norse feud law, which is a real thing, by the way. We have a couple written records of Norse feud law. It's a pretty neat thing. The warrior culture as well is something that I think is an example of people just sort of looking at Viking culture and sort of wrapping dwarves up with Viking culture. It's not really a dwarven thing. In most of the dwarven tales that I read and most of the folklore that I could find, the dwarves are not these sort of, sword in hand warriors or even sneaky assassins. They're mostly just craftsmen. Or, in some cases, maybe they get into a drunken brawl of some kind. But again, these are hard-working, highly skilled craftsmen, not warriors. These are not savage heroes. There is no sort of dwarven warrior culture insofar as it exists purely for them. They might have been a part of a warrior culture. Obviously they are. They're, especially if we're talking about the Nordic dwarves, but it's not a specific dwarven thing that just gets lumped in with them. And finally, dwarven clans. This is another thing that I think gets wrapped up not because of the Norse. I think this is that Proto-Germanic thing that I was talking about earlier in our folkloric footprint, because those would have been organized into tribes or clans, and as such, I think it makes sense to sort of lump these dwarven creatures into a similar fashion. But again, the idea of a proud warrior dwarven clan unfortunately just does not exist. We have evidence of dwarven families in the folklore and the historical legends. We have evidence of even small craft groups of the dwarves, like the gods of the Aesir, essentially just sort of keep, I don't want to call them pets, but they basically keep dwarves around on retainer for the stuff that they need. But there is no such thing as a dwarf clan. Now, we get to talk about werewolves, and I am so excited. This was, by the way, the most interesting, the best part of this research for me. This was so eye-opening in so many different ways, and I'm so excited I get to share this with you. Again, buckle up because it gets real ancient. There is a misconception that werewolf sort of exists as a catch-all term for a spirit or a creature of ill intent. There's even a connection in some cases and in some cultures between werewolf and vampire, that they might actually be the same thing. And I thought that's kind of where this was going to go. I thought this was going to be like our video on goblins, where we basically just found out that goblin is just a catch-all term for a usually good, mischievous spirit. And in fact, I am totally wrong, because the earliest werewolf legends go back to antiquity. They go way back, like further even than the Norse legends. One of them actually comes into the 1st or 2nd century AD in the Apollodorus, which is a collection of Greek myth and legend. However, in this legend, we are introduced to a man named Lycaon of Arcadia. Lycaon is a man who is not convinced that Zeus is as all-powerful, as all-wise, as he says that he is. And so Lycaon murders his son, or unalives his son, I should say, because I don't want to get shadow banned by YouTube. But yeah, he unalives his son, puts him into the food, and then serves the food to Zeus, thinking that Zeus will not be able to tell the difference. Zeus does tell the difference and curses Lycaon to the form of a wolf. You can actually look at this illustration. This is a far later illustration. I believe this is from 1400. But look at his head. Look at his appendages. Look at the ripped clothing. This looks like a werewolf transformation, doesn't it? Now, I did find out that the original translation of the Apollodorus does not have the section where Lycaon is turned into a dog. That was added in later translations. It's unclear to me from the research that I did if dog is mentioned specifically, and there are several different translations of it, or if it just says that Zeus transmogrifies him into a beast rather than a dog. I do want to mention that here though, because it's unclear if that exists in the original translation, but it does bear mentioning here because lycanthrope, which is what we call, or lycanthrope, which is what we call a werewolf or somebody afflicted with a were curse. Lycanthropy comes from the Greek word lykos, but it's also entirely possible that Lycaon helps to serve as an additional link between those words. Again, I thought we were going back to the Saxons. We're not going to the Saxons. We went all the way back to Greece and antiquity, and it gets weirder. From there, people, it gets weirder, because Herodotus mentions a group, a tribe of wolf people living in Noroi. He says that these people have the ability to transform into a wolf, and that they choose to spend part of the year in wolf form. And adding to all of the interesting things that I found, that Noroi area that is up there is where modern day Serbia is, which might be a connection. Again, this is purely conjecture on my part. My neurons are firing on all cylinders, but it might be the connection that we need to the modern interpretation of wolves being fundamentally linked, or werewolves being fundamentally linked to Eastern Europe, because the Noroi, that section that Herodotus brings up, would have been in Eastern Europe. It goes a long way to explain why Eastern Europe in particular keeps getting lumped in with all the werewolf myths, because it originates to Herodotus. It's crazy work. I did not think I was going to find that at all when I was doing the research for this video. Thank you all for getting more than 500 likes, because I would have been bereft if I didn't get a chance to do this research or even tell you all about it. We also get to talk about the werewolves of Ossory. There are Nordic werewolves. I'm going to leave them out of this video because, I'll be honest, they occur right around the same time, and they're far less interesting and fun to talk about. But the werewolves of Ossory are really compelling and interesting. In Iric, I combined Irish and Gaelic, but in Irish/Gaelic legend, Ossory is a kingdom in Ireland that is essentially run by werewolf warriors. The kings of this land, the princes of this land, can take on the form of wolves. They raid opposing shepherds and villages, and sometimes just plunder in order to defend the realm. There's also a connection between Irish werewolves and a mythical group of Irish knights that lived in the wilderness called the Fianna. This is an important band of heroes. You can think of them kind of like an Irish round table, so to speak. Or if you're a fan of anime and you've watched Fate Stay Night, one of the characters in Fate Stay Night, Lancer, is the former leader of the Fianna. It's a fictionalized version of that. But there is a connection amongst the werewolves and the Fianna. It's the idea that these sort of warriors were living out in the wilderness, communing with both gods, ancient magic, and nature itself, and thus were blessed with the ability to turn into wolf-like warriors, which again is really sweet. Also, here is my challenge to all of you. I'm going to join in this. I'm going to point this out right here. Multiple translations and things that I found pointed out that these wolves could be quote unquote defeated and their souls saved by being exposed to the Eucharist. Now, I drew that big white line so that you could all see the host right there that is being presented to the werewolf by a Benedictine monk. I got some flack in the comments about how I brought up that Christian revisionism is a huge deal when we are studying folklore, and it comes up a lot, and people apparently were not happy that I didn't do a whole section of it in that video. They're like, this is conjecture. If you would like an entire video on Christian revisionism and its impact in medieval folklore, and how Christian revisionism and Christian propaganda in some cases has altered or made the study of folklore and history more difficult, I will be happy to do a full video on it. It was left out originally because it's not the main point of my video, but I'm talking to you directly, commenters who were complaining about it. If y'all want it, let me know in the comments. We'll do a full one. But it does bear mentioning here because just like with before, Christian revisionism creeps in often in werewolf myth and legend. It's especially true for the werewolves in these stories. If you look at the Greek interpretations of it, either you are cursed by the gods, but in a lot of cases, particularly with those people from Noroi, it doesn't seem like being a werewolf is necessarily a bad thing. You only get negative interpretations of werewolf and werewolf legends later on in history. One of the reasons that I brought up the Wolves of Ossory in this Irish kingdom is because these legends are mostly positive until the Normans conquer England and then begin to sort of Christianize the legends surrounding them. It's another good example. Now, let's talk about some differences between these things, between werewolves in folklore and legend and the werewolves of modern fantasy. One of the big ones is the idea of the full moon and the curse of lycanthropy being transferred by a bite. This was one of the things that I could not find in any of the oldest sources on werewolves. It's entirely possible that I missed it. We talk, again, quite often about how hard it is, how difficult it is to find sources or accurate sources on folklore, just because, again, it's based on that oral tradition, and a lot of this is ancient, and it's constantly changing. My guess, this is conjecture, but my guess is the moon is a very huge source of sort of pagan inspiration and pagan worship, and as a result, I think it makes sense that as these myths are Christianized, the moon becomes a sole source of creating that evil. It seems, however, far more likely in the stories that I read and in the information that I found that being a werewolf is a curse from a god or a blessing from a god. There's quite a few similarities here, one of which is the painful transformation that does seem to come up often in the stories. Again, the werewolves, especially the werewolves of Ossory, seem to go on these far-reaching adventures. They battle against enemy forces, they clash, they adventure, they plunder, kind of like they would in a fantasy role-playing game. So that's another accurate translation as well. They seem to hunt in packs. There seem to be pack leaders. Shout out to the Book Talk girlies. You're right, ladies. You get a dark gray alpha shadow daddy or whatever the heck Book Talk is obsessed with these days. But yeah, that actually has a lot more basis in historic folklore than one might think. So there's actually a ton of similarities between the werewolves. Once we get past the biting and the moon part of things, there's actually, I think, far more in common with the werewolf than with other creatures that we have covered for this series. It was actually really cool to realize as I was doing the research that there's actually quite a bit of similarity between the pulp and the pop culture and the historic, at least when it comes to werewolves. But now we get to talk about werewolves and dwarves in our games. As always, I included 3 different ideas here, 2 that are historically accurate and 1 that is just absolutely gonzo and insane. So you pick and choose, use what you like. The first thing I want to talk about are the dwarven grudge axes. I wanted to sort of lean in on the idea that the dwarves are not doing the fighting, or the ones keeping the grudges, but they will happily do the work for those who do have a grudge. So they forge these weapons specifically for individuals on a vendetta, a 1v1 fight, a highway to hell, so to speak. The dwarves take a portion of payment up front, but then also take a portion of the deceased's belongings after the person they make the weapon for has carried out their act of vengeance. The important thing to think about, though, with these is that these axes will hum, like literally hum, both physically vibrate and hum in the ears of their wielder, and eventually drive them berserk. The good thing, though, is that the axes sort of grant that superhuman berserker strength to those people, allowing them to fulfill their vendettas. When the axe's job is done, it will crumble into scale, so the weapons are never used again. Some people will say it's because the dwarves do not want to allow these weapons of power falling into the wrong hands. Others will say it's just to ensure repeat customers. The other one that I want to talk about, and before we dive into the werewolf portion, I have to mention Thies of Livonia, who was an 80-year-old man brought in on charges of heresy because he claimed, even at the point of being flogged and exiled, he claimed that he was a werewolf and that he and other werewolves were descending into hell to battle Satan, witches, and demons in the name of Christ. That is amazing. And again, it goes to show that there's sort of this long-lasting seed of positive werewolf energy that exists, even though the Christianization of those countries seems to demonize those wolf creatures. This is actually covered in Carlo Ginzburg's The Night Battles, which I thought was pretty cool. It's well worth a read. It came out in 1983, though, so a lot of stuff is sort of aged out, but it's a fun read. In any case, I loved this story. It had no place in the actual presentation, but I have to talk about Thies of Livonia. And then I thought, well, hey, if Thies is talking about going in and battling hell, let's talk about God's wolves. These are elite shock troops of an ancient order. This monastic order flees into the woods, and instead of being consumed by the wolves that live there, the monks eventually assimilate. They settle down with these wolf women, and their children both take on the lycanthropy of their mothers and the faith of their fathers, thus leading to the God's wolves. Now, these wolves are highly dedicated to battling against evil in all of its forms, and the way that they do that is by surgically altering their claws. They use church secrets, alchemy, botany, science to help imbue their claws with the properties necessary to take on whatever forces of darkness are there. And I love these guys. I think this is like my favorite one that I've ever done. And last but certainly not least, if you really want the unhinged one, you could make wolf chefs. And they keep trying to make, people eat raw meat dishes. They're trying to really have it catch on. They're not violent. They just really think that people should enjoy a raw meat diet. Where are these wolves, or what is the name of these wolves? These are the wolves of Clan Ramsey. And on that note, everybody, thank you so much for watching Desks and Dorks. As always, the YouTube pleasantries go quite a long way. The best way, however, and I'm really grateful for all the support in the comments, but if you really, really want to help us out, the best way to do so is by purchasing our games over at itch.io or from any of our physical distributors, Worldwide Game Distribution, Exalted Funeral, and Indie Press Revolution, or if you're a PDF person, itch.io is the single best way to help us out. It really does mean a lot to me, but it's how I help support myself and how I help pay some of the writers, editors, and people who work with me. It's just a huge deal. But again, thank you all so much for this, and thank you for giving me a chance to talk about werewolves and dwarves. This was far more interesting than goblins and trolls, so thank you for this. I really, really, really sincerely appreciate it. But until next time, I am Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. You have been absolutely amazing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.